Hey friends, welcome to You Matter podcast. I'm Shane Stanford, and today we have a great conversation for you. One that we've been trying to get on the books for some time now, but either I was traveling or something was happening, or our guest was traveling and out. But I'm very excited about my talk today with Dr. Tim Tennent, who is currently the president of Asbury Seminary, is transitioning in that role, and we'll talk to him more about that in just a little bit. Tim, it's great to have you on You Matter podcast.
Thank you, Shane. It's great to be here. Looking forward to it.
You've had a lot going on in your life, and as I said, you are in the middle of one of the most significant transitions for you in your journey, and certainly want to talk about that. But up until now, if someone did not know Tim Tennent, what would you say about your journey to here so far?
Well, my journey, like yours, Shane, has been seeking to answer the call of God to use my life for the sake of the gospel. And so in my early life, I was a pastor for a decade, and then I was spent probably 15 years or so in higher education teaching, and then eventually now the last 15 years serving Asbury. We also been very involved overseas in mission work in India especially. So our lives done different things, from pastoring to teaching to administration to missionary work, but all of it is about proclaiming the gospel and communicating the gospel to the ends of the earth. That's my passion. That's my interest.
Well, and I know that you have taken that so seriously and have done such a great work at it. What I've always wanted to ask this question: what led you into the mission field and working in India? Tell us a little bit about that transition.
Well, my wife, Julie, her great aunt had spent 33 years in India. And so when we were a young married couple, we had India on our prayer list. We were always praying for India. And we actually had gone there for a visit together right at the beginning of our married lives. We had opportunity to go there. So we had been to India. But in the low 80s, I had an opportunity. I met a pastor, a leader of India, actually, that was going to start the seminary. And he came to visit me in Georgia because he knew our love for India. And we went over to our prayer meeting. You know, I went early morning, just prayer time in my church where I was a pastor. And the Lord spoke to him and said, "Please come to India and help me start this school." So it happened through just the grace of God and getting to know a particular pastor, a leader in India that's been real influential in my life, George Tennent.
What was the first thing you noticed about being in that culture and sharing the gospel? What was it that struck you?
Well, I had been a pastor and, doing various things over the years, but I got to India and I realized that the barrier was so much higher. That really put me on so much like a lifelong journey. How do you communicate the gospel to a Hindu? Because they had questions I'd never heard of. They had concerns I'd never thought of. And so India was always fascinating to me because it represented such a big challenge for Christian communication. And so I've often said that most of my life has been responding to the question, why did things not work well for me when I first went to India? Because I spent so much time to figure out, why is it so difficult here? And it's been a joyous journey to learn more about India and how to better communicate the gospel there.
Well, I know a little bit about its history, of course. I know about some of the political dynamics over the last 100 years in particular. What was it about that particular culture, though, that you found the most challenging? If I can just peel back the layers a little bit on that. I think this is a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, I grew up in the Bible Belt, where there's a lot of presuppositions about Christian kind of categories that kind of pervaded the air, right? And so I got to India, and I went to North India, not South India. There's a strong Christian culture in the South. In North India, you're really in a new world. And so I was working with people that were completely Hindu, who had no background in Christianity. I could give you stories that would blow your mind to show you how they just had no idea. And they had questions about God, about salvation, about sin, about things that, but they used their own categories that was way, way off the way I thought about it. And So yeah, it was just being immersed with people who just were utterly in a worldview, totally just disconnected from any Christian conversation I'd ever had before.
Have you found that to be the case? I know you've studied, you've been an academic in terms of looking at the differences in world religions and Christianity. What would you say are the primary things we don't understand as those who've grown up in the Bible Belt or in a predominantly Christian area about the way other religions see who we are?
Yeah, and there's many things. I think that, Indians don't have a category of, sin producing guilt. In a basic, what is the basic problem that the gospel tries to solve in terms of people's salvation? Hindus don't have that category. And therefore, they live in a world of karma. They live in a world where different kind of categories come into play. And what we would call the gospel, the good news, doesn't strike them as good news. They never really thought they needed to be forgiven of sin, because they don't really have a category of sin or guilt, things like that. So, it's a different world, and it's been wonderful. And I've learned so much from talking to Hindus, because they have their own understanding of what they call avatara, which is incarnations that happen in the Hindu world, and therefore they just want to know, is that what Jesus is like? The Hindus generally, I would just put it bluntly, you're talking to a Muslim, for example, Muslims would say, no, we disagree with that. We disagree for these three reasons. We know that world. We think this, no, we think that. But the Hindus, we believe that. Hinduism defeats you by absorbing you, not by saying no. They say yes to everything. So I've never been in an environment where whatever you say, oh, yeah, that's great. That's wonderful. Yeah, that's part of, if you have 30 million gods, why not add one more?
Yeah, sure. Yes. Just put them on the list.
So it's a very syncretistic environment. The Hinduism defeats you by swallowing you, not by spitting you out. And that's a very different kind of approach to how we do apologetics in the West, where it's just so based on assuming that there's a categories of, this is right, this is wrong, this is truth, this is false. Those categories don't exist in the same way.
Well, and I think sometimes we forget that the two largest world religions, Christianity and Islam, both come from very similar traditions in terms of conversations, as you would say, that are similar in nature. There's a whole other half of the world that, as you've said, do not have these conversations. Where would you consider, and this is as a guy who is a professor of teaching about the world and faith, where do you think is the most difficult place for Christians to be involved in just the daily ongoing life of the world?
Well, there's different categories of that. When I was at Gordon Conwell, we did a study to determine how could you develop measurements for developing resistance. Like, where is the most resistant people groups in the world to the gospel? Where is it most receptive? The surprising thing was the 10 most resistant groups to the gospel were all found in Western Europe.
Huh.
And the most receptive groups were all in China or India.
Wow.
So from a point of view of just like receptivity to the gospel, India is a place where there's a lot of opportunity for Christianity, as well as China. Of course, China has 80 million Christians. There's a lot of potential there. The post-Western world, the post-Christian world in the West, there are challenges. That is a difficult mission field. That's still different from the other. I think maybe what you're asking about is like just categorically, if you're dealing with like talking about categories like sin or judgment or hell or saviors and all that. I would say definitely China and India would be difficult, very difficult. But in terms of people's openness and receptivity to the gospel, India is a much better place than you might think.
So in the conversation about, when you think about 80 million Christians in China, I think people forget that would be by far the largest Christian group in the United States, by far, if that group was in the United States. So I think sometimes we forget about the massive nature of both of China, but also the work that's gone into sharing the gospel in that part of the world, and how that has shown a lot of fruit in spite of, I think, what some people understand sometimes. Eastern Europe, talk to me about that a little bit, because that is a conversation that I've heard from several of the folks that we do ministry with, The fact that it's not just that they're not open to it, but there's a real antagonism towards Christianity, particularly the Western versions of Christianity, for a number of reasons. And I've heard this from several of our podcast guests. What do you think goes into that conversation?
I think Eastern Europe represents one of the examples of kind of the post-Christian residue of Christendom, where they come from cultures that have a strong orientation toward a particular religion. So like I spent a lot of time in the former Yugoslavia where, the Bosnians are Muslims, to be a Bosnian, be a Muslim, to be a Croat, to be a Roman Catholic, it's like in Europe, Northern Europe is Roman Catholic, Southern Europe is Protestant, all of that. Southern Europe is Roman Catholic, Northern Europe is Protestant. That dynamic is very strong, and they're sick of it. They're tired of it. They don't like the fact that, it's like I always say, like the Romanian Orthodox Church. Well, it's Romanian first, it's Orthodox second. Church.
Sure.
The nationalistic identity is so strong, and so the actual gospel is obscured. So I was spending time in Eastern Europe every year for 11 years of my life. I was there every year. And I saw a hollowness in people's eyes because it was during all of the horrible wars, the Balkan Wars. I was there during all of that period. And people just felt like that their faith had forsaken them. That God had not, they just had no hope. It's like Ukraine today. People just felt like in our hour of need, they just felt completely abandoned. And it was really hard for them. And I taught at the North Star Bible College right there in the middle of that amazing city. And when I first went there, I got into the ground floor and looked up. It was like a 5-story building. You could see the stars, and the whole thing bombed out. They had to rebuild their structure from inside out. And to see the students there trying to learn and figure out and answer questions. And most of them had family members or church members that had been, that's where ethnic cleansing that phrase was invented in that part of the world under Milosevic. And so they had seen atrocities that were, I had one night, a woman who came to, I was at a church one night, preached the gospel, and the altar, a woman came down to the altar, and she said to me that the Serbs had held her arms, and she lived in a bakery, and they put her children in a bakery, in an oven, and made her watch her children die. And so he asked me, how can I forgive them? Well, what was I to give her? Some simple evangelical answer? I just felt like I could do nothing but weep. That kind of pain was just so hard to grasp when I was there.
Well, and Tim, I hope you see that I'm working this thing around to a particular conversation. We don't seem to do well when we become more and more tribal in nature when it comes to faith. We lose ourselves, I think, in terms of both the gospel, but also in terms of how the gospel lands in terms of our daily life and daily world. And, one of the concerns that I had it in several conversations over this season of our podcast have been about why Christians have become so much more tribal, it seems, in the last few years of being able to deal with conversations without, for some reason, creating an us and them kind of approach to things. Now, I do realize that theology and ideology and being able to stand on certain values, that is a different conversation. But even in that part, we tend to get it right, but then we keep moving until we are not getting it right anymore, if you know what I'm trying to say. And so I would love to get your thoughts on that, because we're living in a more and more divided world. And just, as you look at this world, as you look at the church, and we've had so many different places where we've been divided, what is your first impression of that when you think of the nature of the gospel?
Yeah, it's just, I guess, worth saying what's maybe obvious to some, maybe less obvious to others, that the Christian church is the most diverse ethnically and multi and religiously and linguistically diverse movement in the history of the world. And there isn't any movement as diverse as the Christian church. And I do think that when you travel around and meet brothers and sisters around the world, it does enrich and deepen your own faith. And you hear their questions, their struggles. I spent this morning with a a bishop from Africa, a wonderful experience to just have those kind of interactions with Christians around the world. So yeah, I think there's a wonderful good. I think ecumenism is mostly a good word. That the household of faith that we share with Christians all over the world. And we are being tribalized today. And so you're right. We need to find ways to reach across to Christians. That's a very different question than people who are out of orthodoxy. But within there's that great phrase in the early church, where talked about how what has been believed always by everywhere by everyone. And I do think that is the kind of the shared faith of the church is a great unifying force, and it goes across the world.
Mm. Well, it's funny you said that. I've spent the morning with a bishop from Nigeria, and so one of the things he said as we got into this conversation, and one of the things he said to me was, I don't think I'll ever forget it. He said, for years, the archaic ways that we harmed each other in my area of the world. This is what his quote was. He said, "I'm starting to see the roots of that spring up in the United States." And I asked him to explain, and he said, and he did, and he explained it very similar to if you were watching any of our cable news shows in the afternoon about just the way that he never thought he would see especially with our separation of church and state, he never thought that he would see the church having such responsibility in some of the most divisive conversations that seemed to be unrelated to the sharing of the gospel itself. And I'm not even sure there's a question there, Tim. I just know that I keep hearing that a lot about, what does church and state actually mean? How would you answer that? The whole idea of the division of church and state.
Well, I don't know if you know the book by Neil Howe. It's a New York Times bestseller, but it's called The Fourth Turning is Here.
Yes.
In that book, he argues that the Western world is headed toward a crisis. That's why I call it the fourth turning of the fourth generation turns. And he believes that the most likely scenario is some kind of civil war could happen, in our country. Well, we never thought that would be possible.
Sure.
The difference is we don't have a civil war that is like north and south. It's actually almost in every city, every town,
every community. Yeah,
it's a really tribalized civil war that could break out into great hostilities. And so, I think that wisely our founders understood that whenever you get the church into a Christendom mode where we are going to have a church-run society, look at Europe. It's not actually gone that well. Mm. And so I do think that the diversity of our faith in the West has been good in the U.S. And I think that, but I think the problem we're having today is that, a pluralistic society is different from a completely what John Neal called the naked society. It's one thing to have a pluralistic public square and have a naked public square.
Yes.
The move to silence all religious voices in the Western world, which includes not just Baptists and Presbyterians, but like Mormons and Muslims, to silence those voices and really come to a naked public square is a great danger to our society. And that's going to cause a powder keg. And I do think that the original vision was not a naked public square, but a pluralistic public square.
Well, I'll tell you, since you're one of the last podcasts of the season, I've been referring to those, I call them angling in moments in every podcast where you go, that was worth the time to do the interview. What you just said was worth the time to do the interview because you've given us, I think, one of the better answers that I've heard about the struggle we're in, because you have people who want to be free from religion, and then you have those who talk about being free for religion. Those are really two very different concepts of people that think they're in the same place, and they're actually not. And so I really appreciate that. And I'd love to have you come back maybe for next season, and let's talk about this more. But there are a couple other things I want to talk about. I just find this fascinating, Tim. Thank you for doing that. You are in the middle of transitioning after 15 years as president of Asbury Seminary.
Yes.
I have I did not go to Asbury, but as people know, I have become a super fan of Asbury throughout the last years of my life, and am so thankful for the work you guys have been doing. What caused this transition, I guess, is the first question for you to make this decision.
Well, there was a practical side and a spiritual side. The practical side is that last year we finished our 100th anniversary and the completion of our strategic plan and our campaign. There's a lot of, kind of things that were rolling through the institution's life that all culminated in 2023 when we had our centennial. So it was a good scene time. I either need to transition out or stay for 10, 15 more years. So I think it was, in a practical way, it was probably a good time. But I didn't really necessarily plan on it, but I did observe that. And so I took a sabbatical after my finished the 2023 celebration. And I had spent time in prayer about my future, what should I do? And does the Lord have another calling for me? And during that time, I had a really strong encounter with John 21, that text where Jesus says, cast your net on the other side of the boat. And I really sensed the Lord telling me that he had called me to Asbury. And I've always felt through all these years, despite challenges, ups, downs, the kind of life of being a president of the seminary, I never lost my calling. And I felt a strong sense of calling. I felt on that day, the Lord said, I am lifting your calling. It's time for you to transition to another ministry.
Wow.
I don't know what that is yet, but
I was going to ask if you've got any closer to that revelation.
No, I asked the Lord, and he said, we're not going to talk about that right now. So
I've been in that place, by the way, and it's unshakable. I mean, it's a very it's not a peaceful place to be, put it that way, but it's very important to be there.
Yeah, it is. And it's been really good for us just to realize that, I think part of me is I've been bound up a lot with, how do I explain this? My personhood has been swallowed in some ways with my position, being president. And it's been, one of the things the Lord said to me was that, I love you because of who you are. And it's not because you are the leader of a seminary, or you raise money, or you balance budgets, or you bring students in, or do a podcast with Shane Stanford. The Lord loves me just because I'm his child. And I think it's been really a great season for us spiritually, really just to kind of remember who we are in Jesus Christ and to be ready for a fresh calling. Even though I don't like to say it publicly, I think that God putting us on the string and having us wait is probably good for us. It's good for our spiritual life. So I'm actually thankful for it.
Well, I do believe the Lord gets to us through these moments of transition in ways that he can't get to us in other ways. I know that's been the case for my health and also other transitions in my life. And so I don't recommend it to anyone. I'm very clear. Don't pray for it because you'll get it.
I know.
And in full disclosure, I do want to say that you are coming on to be part of the board of JourneyWise and the More West Center, and we are over the moon about that.
Absolutely, I'm excited about it, and I obviously have opportunities, but I have turned many board requests down. But I really wanted to be a part of your board because I have such a heart for communication, training young lay people, and the vision you have is great. So if I can be some small help, I'm delighted.
Well, thank you. And it really is personally and in terms of the rest of the board, we're very excited about it. When you think of the future of the evangelical Wesleyan world, we've had a lot of talk about change and transition. We've had a lot of it over the last few years. First of all, your impressions of where we are right now versus 10 years ago. What have you seen happen and what is your heart full of as you look back on these last 10 years of transition?
Well, I do think we are in a hopeful moment in the history of the Wesleyan movement. Unfortunately, it comes with a negative and a positive side. I do think there is a fracturing in kind of the old alliances that represented by, Fuller, Trinity, Gordon Conwell, and kind of the National Church of Evangelicals, all of that Christianity Today magazine, all of those things that kind of defined Christian in North America is in a very much a transitional state. And the Wesleyan voice has an opportunity to be heard in ways never have in my lifetime. The emergence of the Gold Methodist Church and other type movements like that, of course, is very positive. I think there's also challenges with all of that because I think there's a big push throughout the country for every church to become just kind of generically Christian, and you end up losing the distinctive voice of what brought us to the forefront. And I always view that every church has its own gifts to the larger body of Christ, and there's particular gifts that Wesleyans have. I think, by the way, I think that Reformed and Dispensational and Pentecostal and other groups also have gifts they bring to the church. But I think we have our gifts, and I would hate the church to lose it by us all becoming just generically evangelical. So I really hope that we would not only grow as a movement, but grow as a distinctive Wesleyan movement that really brings out Trinitarian faith, full sanctification, holiness, discipleship, all the things that really form us as a movement, to me, are really, really important.
One really troubling trend that I'm seeing right now, and I'm experiencing it in the church that I'm very close to and helped found, but I'm seeing it in a lot of other places, and that is churches who disaffiliate but who don't join another fellowship or community of churches. They go independent, which I totally understand what's in the mindset of that, but I do think there is a danger there, particularly as you're starting to hear some of these churches that have long Wesleyan backgrounds who have gone out and hired senior pastors now that have no Wesleyan background whatsoever, and many of them are not trained in terms of in terms of theological training. What is your, and here you're in the business of helping train folks and guide folks. Any thoughts or impressions about that?
Well, I do think, to be fair to those churches, I do think that, to put it bluntly, getting divorced and getting married are two separate acts. I think it makes sense that you wouldn't necessarily get divorced on one day and get married the next. So I think a period of discernment is wise. And I think the big question from my mind is, what will happen 2-3 years from now? Will these churches remain independent? And I think for all the reasons you mentioned, I think I have concerns about that because part of the Wesleyan movement is connectionalism, episcopacy, et cetera, is part of what we value. So anyway, that's a good point. But I think it's on the other side, the GMC must have a value proposition for large churches. I mean, if you're a small church, it makes perfect sense, but a large church has their own needs and their own kind of life that needs to be addressed by a new denomination. And so that's going to be one of the growth points of the GMC as to how do they relate to large churches. But I do hope that these churches, A, become part of a larger movement, and B, that they maintain a Wesleyan emphasis. I do hope that and pray that. I'm like you. I think that's really helpful.
Interestingly enough, we are speaking in a few days towards a group of churches, large churches, mega churches that have come together in a very specific relationship, and found out that in that meeting that not only will we be talking to the leaders of the couple of dozen churches that have come together, but each church has gone out and found those churches that are disaffiliated and did not go one direction or the other and have brought them into a fellowship with the large church. And so immediately, even these folks realize pretty quickly, hey, we can't just be thinking about ourselves. We've got brothers and sisters down the road in our area who don't have the resources to just go out and find the next pastor or go out and develop what they need next stage. And I really have been proud of that. One of the things, though, I wanted to ask you before our time is up, though, is you've now made, and I think you are one of maybe two people in the United States that have been most responsible for helping to make theological education basically available to just about anyone, anywhere, in any season of life. We got to participate with you guys through the mobile campus at Memphis. One of the best things that Christ Church ever did, one of the best things I was a part of there. But now you're in Tulsa. You've got, I think, Colorado Springs, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
What what do you think is the future of theological education as related to both, not just, I think you've answered the question of viability in terms of a person's life, Tim. I really do. I think this is a great model, and having online and hybrid. But in terms of its place in leading the church, because I'm seeing a trend of maybe pushback that people don't have to do theological education anymore from some areas. What do y'all talk about, or how do you respond to that in your world?
Well, I think that the country as a whole is going to go to a place with a lot less seminaries than we have now, and more seminaries with extension sites like we have. It's going to be a sifting process, but a small seminary today has a hard time surviving in this climate. And so I think in some ways we'll see. I mean, Asbury's now in Tulsa, Colorado Springs, Memphis, Orlando, Tampa, et cetera. That's going to continue on. Now we're in Bangalore and London and maybe in Colombia. It's going to continue on in that way. I think in terms of like churches, I think one of the things that's misunderstood is that people today, our generation especially, think that ordination is like the gate. That's the gate to ministry. That's how we were raised.
Yeah.
In the current context, that's not true. People are being trained at Asbury every day, even with MDiv degrees. Don't go out and get ordained, but get brought into churches to serve them and help them, and not part of and even the Methodist Church. We have a lot who go out and get hired by churches that are not part of the appointment process.
Yeah.
So I do think that we're in a situation today where the way people think about education is not so much through credentialing like we did. And therefore, we have to prove to them that what we offer has a real value to them and really helps their lives, help their ministries in practical ways, not because they're required to come do it. So I think in some ways we got to kind of get out of our head all this about requirements and just say, well, can we make out what we do so compelling, so amazing, our product so powerful that anybody wants to be a pastor say, I would like that training. And I think that when it comes to like what a seminary does, if a seminary is just conveying information about theology, church history, et cetera, even exegetical work, and it will not survive. It has to be brought together with formative work, and not only doctrine, but life and practices. And that happens through rhythms of life with real people. So I think that the future is very exciting. It's just going to look completely different than it's looked what we saw when we grew up.
I appreciate this very much, Tim. This has been a great conversation. I know we've gone through about 8 or 9 completely different topics, but that's what makes this fun. The last question, the one that we ask of all of our guests, is this question: where do you think God has Tim Tennent mattering the most right now in your journey?
I think one of the great gifts of this position is that I have a voice to help people understand things. And one of my gifts is communication. And I've had literally thousands of Methodists, especially around the world, that they found that something I wrote or said or spoke, has helped them understand the issues we're facing today. And so I think my goal in my life and what God has curated in my life is to help, communicate things and think about things theologically. And so that's what we do. I'm not good at a lot of things, but I do know how to help the church think better about things, and also to understand the importance of thinking. Because today we have to reclaim the fact that thinking is important and truth is important. And all that is part of what drives me and makes me get up in the morning. And I hope that can continue in the years to come. And it's not tied just to Asbury. It's wherever God leads me. I hope to be part of that project.
That's wonderful. Tim, thank you so much for being with us on You Matter. And of course, to those who are listening, you can find this wherever podcasts are made available. But if you lose your way, go to journeywise.network. You'll see our link for podcasts, and we would love for you to subscribe and to give us a good rating, and of course come back and share and listen. We thank you for that. Be salt and light. You matter. God bless you.